Welcome, everyone. We're just letting everyone in from the waiting room, but as you join, feel free to put your name and where you're joining us from in the chat. We'll see who's with us today. Like we have about 50 or so who've joined us already. Welcome. Happy to see where people are coming from. That's great. Go ahead and get started. Welcome. I'm Kirsten Faulkner from Historic Hawai Foundation. We're very excited to have a really outstanding group of panelists and presenters for us today to talk about heritage documentation as a preservation tool. So thank you all for being with us, and we're looking forward to a nice presentation. Historic Hawai Foundation is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. We are a statewide nonprofit organization that helps people preserve historic places. And I am joined today by our Education Program Manager, Andrea Nandoscar, and our Development Program Manager, Michelle Kizik. So thanks to both of them for providing the technical support and all the work for this program. The Historic Hawai Foundation has been partnering with the National Park Service for several years on putting together these preservation and practice training sessions. And we're very pleased to be continuing that agreement and to be able to provide some really outstanding topics and presenters to share different aspects of historic preservation. So we really want to mahalo them for being part of this program and for sharing their expertise and really helping to promote an ethic of historic preservation across the country. Today's seminar has also been approved for continuing education certificate maintenance credits for the American Institute of Certified Planners. This is done through a co-sponsorship and partnership with the American Planning Association Hawaii chapter. So we thank APA Hawaii for supporting continuing education for planning professionals. The American Institute of Architects Honolulu chapter has also approved the seminar for the AIA CES credits, and for architects seeking credit, at the end of the presentation during the pop-up course evaluation, there will be a line asking for your name and your AIA number. So be sure to put that in as part of the evaluation so that we can consolidate those and share them with AIA so that they can send them in so you can get your credits. We have some really outstanding speakers. We're excited to have several from the National Park Service, as well as several who are doing work in our communities. So first, we're going to hear from Elaine Jackson-Rotondo. She's joining us from the Bay Area in California, and she is the Regional Preservation Partnerships and History Programs Manager. So Dr. Elaine Jackson-Rotondo is both trained as an architect and an architectural historian, and she oversees the National Historic Landmarks Program for the region that includes Hawaii. Oops. I skipped Scott. Scott Keys is the chief of the Heritage Documentation Programs for the National Park Service. He is joining us from Washington, D.C. So he will be explaining the three major documentation programs that National Park Service manages: the Historic American Building Survey, the Historic American Engineering Record, and the Historic American Landscape Survey. We're really excited to have Scott join us today as well. They'll be followed by Jay Sturdivant, who is here with us locally. He's the Integrated Resources Program Manager at both the Pearl Harbor National Memorial and the Honouli'uli National Historic Site, both on Oahu. So he's going to share a recent project that was done at Honouli'uli and show how documentation was used as part of preservation of a really important site feature for that National Historic Site. He's going to be followed by Matt McDermott, who's an archaeologist and program manager with Cultural Surveys Hawaii. Cultural Surveys Hawaii has partnered with Historic Hawai Foundation to put together some really exciting story maps for different historic districts in Hawaii on several different islands. So he's going to be explaining how that project was put together and what some of the functionalities of that have been. So mahalo to Matt. And then our final speaker is Lilia Marin, who is a cultural resource specialist, field assistant, and alakai with Noho Papa, Hawaii. She's also going to be sharing some of the inventory and survey work that has been done to share ethno-historical research and working with using traditional cultural and indigenous knowledge to help stewardship and education based in Native Hawaiian places and cultural traditions. So really excited to see some of that work and how it's being applied in the field for stewardship as well. Our webinar today is planned for about 90 minutes. We're going to have those overview presentations and then the 3 project examples. And then at the end, we will have time for some discussion with all of our presenters. So as we go, please use the chat function and we will take as many of those questions as we can. This program is being recorded. At the end of the presentation today, it will be posted to the Historic Hawaii website as well as to our YouTube channel, so it'll be available there. We have enabled closed captioning, so if you would like to see the subtitles, you can just enable that with your Zoom controls. It is voice recognition, so it may not always recognize some of our Hawaiian words, but it kind of does the best it can. And then when it's posted to YouTube, closed captioning will be enabled there as well. So I believe that is all of our introduction. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Jackson Rotondo to talk to us about what is documentation. Mahalo, Elaine.
Good morning. Mahalo. So, we're just going to start with the basics of, what do we mean by documentation? Next slide, please. For the purpose of today's presentation, we mean the intentional collection of information about historic, cultural, or heritage resources in the service of preservation, stewardship, the historical record, education, interpretation. That documentation can be of a building, landscape, structure, or an area in whole, in its entirety, or in part. This isn't to ignore the value of serendipitous documentation, such as a snapshot of a person standing in front of a building or even a journal entry that provides a description of a place. These are the gems that, researchers find so useful when there is very little or no intentional documentation available. Next slide, please. What are some of the tools or means for documenting a property? Next slide. Photographs may first come to mind when we think about how to document a structure, building, landscape, or even an object, as we see in this image of a woman with a child in front of the Alani Palace. Next slide. However, despite the overused adage that a picture is worth 1,000 words, written description can be a valuable means of documentation, as you can see from this quote, where you start to get more of the texture and the dimensions of the buildings, as well as materials on the inside of the building. Next slide, please. Sketches and formal architectural drawings can help convey spatial organization and provide detailed information about the building size, construction details, and additional information about materiality. Next slide, please. And of course, we now have technologies that allow us to capture data about resources that are difficult to access. Next slide. Here we have an image on the and model that was done by a team who combined LiDAR, sonar, photogrammetry, HD video technologies to create a baseline data set and computer model of the submerged USS Arizona, which you saw from the aerial view in the previous slide. This documentation was created for historic preservation and public outreach purposes. And the documentation product actually continues to provide value beyond the original scope of the project And the digital archive that was created can be used as a baseline for future surveys, accurately monitoring change over time, and supporting historic resource management and planning. I want to take just a couple of minutes to further demonstrate the value of using multiple means of documentation. Next slide, please. These are beautiful photos of the Kauai Bridge near Hana on Maui. They capture the overall form and structure of the bridge and the setting. Next slide. Photos accompanied by a verbal description can provide information not readily discernible, such as the overall dimensions with more specificity, as you can see from the data sheet in the middle, as well as the materials, the history of a resource, including ownership, dates of construction, changes over time, how a space or landscape was used and how it was constructed, which isn't always apparent from a photograph, who constructed it or cultivated or transformed the landscape, and then also the significance of the resource. Next slide, please. And then, of course, a drawing or a sketch can depict what is difficult to understand or capture in either a photograph or written description, such as the overall layout or the construction of details, as you can see in the axonometric of the bridge. And there's a section at the top, and then you can also see the plan and how it is in the landscape. Next slide. Drawings can be particularly helpful in documenting larger structures and landscapes that may be more difficult to comprehend, spatially and materially. These are images of the Pi'ilani Heiau, also on Maui. There are aerial views available online that provide more comprehensive overviews. But we also have, next slide, these drawings from the HALS collection, part of Scott's program. And these drawings, in this instance, capture the overall layout, as well as detailed information such as the differing lava rock patterns, as you can see in those 4 squares at the bottom of the sheet. Next slide. As well as how the heiau sits within the landscape and topography. Together, all 3 means of documentation provide more information about a resource than a single means and can aid in the stewarding of the historic or cultural resource. Next slide. Which really brings us to the question of why document. Next slide, please. Historic and cultural resources, are documented for any number of variety of immediate reasons and uses. It could be historic designation. These processes dictate the type of information needed for documentation. The images that you see on the slide are of the Mauna Kea Adds Quarry National Historic Landmark. And the documentation includes the written description, historical context, statement of significance, as well as maps and photographs. Documentation can also be used to monitor condition, as I mentioned on the slide for the USS Arizona. Documentation can also be used for preservation treatment, such as rehabilitation or restoration, as well as education and interpretation. The example on the screen is documentation in service of both education and restoration of a cultural landscape. I think sometimes when we talk about documentation used for education, we think about it only in terms of that documentation will then be used to create curriculum. In this case, the actual documentation of the site helped with the restoration of the heiau, and it used both older documentation in the form of a 1950 archaeological map and annotated drawings by Henry Kekehuna, which were based on measure drawings and oral histories. And the students learned how to use a plane table to add to that documentation, while at the same time, the cultural teachers spent time in the classrooms of the participating high schools to share cultural knowledge that would be required of each of them, as well as the protocols as they visited the site. Next slide. Documentation can also be used for regulatory purposes. This is an example of documentation that the Navy was required to do because they were planning to demolish a neighborhood. But I really want to describe that, emphasize that regardless of the immediate reason for documenting a property, documentation can capture the process of creating or constructing, dismantling, change over time, or even loss or erasure from the landscape, in which case the documentation helps to preserve that history of those built environments and cultural landscapes. I also like to think about how documentation might be used in the more distant future, such as academic study to understand patterns of development, spatial practices, or even where neighborhoods or landscapes have been destroyed. Next slide. What type, I think a question that comes up frequently is what type of documentation should be used? Next slide, please. As we've seen, historic and cultural properties are documented for a variety of reasons and uses. Historic designation processes dictate the type of information needed for documentation. I'm sorry. I am in the wrong place in my presentation. I apologize. The means and level of documentation, as well as the format, really depends on the type of resource being documented, the intended purpose or reason for the documentation, the skill of the person conducting the documentation, the available tools and means, and then, of course, the cost, because depending on the type of documentation you use, it can be more or less costly. Next slide. I do want to state, though, that documentation doesn't have to use high technology, doesn't have to be fancy, and it doesn't have to result in, a 50-page document. And to illustrate that, I just want to close with some images of some catalog cards. Next slide, please. These are catalog cards. For those of you not familiar with catalog cards, they're, about a little larger than 3x5 index card. And these are from the HABS HAER HALS program. And these are images of 3 separate cards, the front and back. And if we go to the next slide, we can see how much detail can be captured in just a few sentences, where you capture who owned the building, what's the material, where is it located, as well as at the very bottom of each card where the text is, where did this information come from? And then when you look at the hand drawings, these are actually hand drawings, not drafted, you get information about the elevations, the plan, or if you look at the one on the right in particular, it is labeled with the dimensions, etc. And so this illustrates that, once again, it doesn't have to be fancy, and you can capture a lot of information in a small space or in a few pages. And with that, I'll turn this over to my colleague, Scott Keys.
All right, thank you, Elaine. Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to speak with you today. My name is Scott Keys. I am the manager of the Heritage Documentation Programs in Washington, D.C. for the National Park Service. What our office does is administer 3 programs. One is the Historic American Building Survey, or HABS. One is the Historic American Engineering Record, or HAER. And one is the Historic American Landscape Survey, or HALS. And what these programs do is document historic properties throughout the country through the creation of drawings, photographs, and historical reports. All the documentation that's created through the programs is archived in the Library of Congress, where it's available to the public, copyright free. And at the bottom of this page here, you can just see a few examples from each of the collections from Hawaii. So next slide, please. So this program has been around for a long time. It started as a make work program during the New Deal in 1933. It was later codified into law with the National Historic Preservation Act, which required the Secretary of Interior and by extension the National Park Service to develop uniform standards for documenting historic properties and submitting that documentation to the Library of Congress. And so my office primarily deals with developing these standards and then making sure that all the documentation that's created throughout the country is reviewed and processed and ends up in the Library of Congress. Next slide, please. So what are the components of traditional documentation that's in the HABS HAER HALS collection? There's three main components. The first is measured drawings. So those are where people go out on site and take measurements either by hand or using laser scanners or newer technology, and then create standard architectural plans, sections, elevations. For example, this is an old section of the old Maui courthouse in Lahaina, which unfortunately was destroyed during the fire. Next slide. It also consists of photographs. Since the start of the program, all of the photographs in the collection are still on large format film. So that's film with minimum negative dimensions of 4 inches by 5 inches, such as this photo from Pearl Harbor here. Next slide, please. However, with recent upgrades in technology and ways of archiving and storing digital information, we are currently working with the Library of Congress to develop standards for incorporating digital photographs into the collection. We're in the middle of that process, but we are making good progress. So hopefully in the next few years, that will happen. And this here is one of our photographers was out in Hawaii for another project and is testing various technologies and requirements and took this photo, digital photo of St. Benedict's Church on the Big Island. Next slide, please. And last, as Elaine was talking about, is historical reports. So that's basically information that can accompany photographs or drawings that tells you a lot of basic information about the property, about its physical characteristics, and also its history and its significance. And we have two different formats. We have a short format and an outline format, which is actually the longer format, which just give this basic information. Next slide, please. So why should you do HABS HAER HALS? Why to use them? Next slide. So where does HABS HAER HALS documentation comes from? It really comes from three main sources. So this chart here on the right kind of shows you where documentation since 2015 is coming from. 16% comes from in-house projects. So those are projects that are still carried out by an in-house team that works in my office of architects, photographers, and historians. 41% comes from federal agency mitigations, as Elaine was talking about with the Navy housing at Pearl Harbor. That's when people are demolishing or substantially altering a building. And during Section 106 consultation, they identify HABS HAER HALS as one of the mitigation requirements in order to conclude the consultation. And last is donated work. So that's work either coming through state SHPO offices relating to local or state level laws. It's also student work from various universities, competition entries. We have various competitions, and then just interested professionals throughout the country that are donating their work to the collection. And so that comprises where this comes from. Go to the next slide. Since this program has been around for a very long time, almost 100 years now, there's now a lot of properties in the collection. There's over 45,000 properties that have been documented in the HABS HAER HALS collection. That includes more than 70,000 drawings, 300,000 photographs, and 250,000 pages of history. All the documentation that's in the collection is in the public domain, so anyone can use it for whatever purpose they want without having to require permissions. Most of it is also digitized, so anyone can go to the website that's here on this slide and go and look up a property and download the history or the drawings or the photographs for that property. And that brings me to one of the reasons why I think this is an amazing resource that we have in our country. And it's not really, I can't think of very many other countries that have a similar type of archive, is that As a federal program, the federal government is putting resources into maintaining these collections, helping to process them. And what it's doing is creating a long-term permanent repository for this information for the public good. So if you already are documenting things, if you're doing drawings for building renovation or taking photographs of buildings or doing historical reports for some other purpose, if you can modify those things slightly in ways that meet the requirements of the HABS or HALS collection, it's making that information more readily available to a wider swath of the public. And it's also ensuring that that is going to be archived in perpetuity by the librarians of the Library of Congress. And so it's a great public resource that people can use and utilize for the public good. Next slide, please. Another thing that you can use this for is, and this is what we do a lot, in many cases, HABS or HALS documentation can create plans or drawings of a building that can help property managers to preserve or rehabilitate historic resources. This is particularly useful if you have vernacular buildings or buildings where there's no plans that survive. This is an example here on the East Coast of the Weir Farm in Connecticut, where they have some important 19th century art in it. It didn't have a climate control system, and there were no drawings of the farm. So we went in, and next slide. We went in and we did laser scanning of it. So this is a screenshot of the laser scanning of the inside of the farm. And then next slide. Created a set of architectural drawings off of that. And then the property managers there at the historic site can use those drawings, hand them over to engineers or architects, and then they can use those as the baseline for starting to figure out how to rehabilitate this building to add climate control and other requirements that they need. So therefore, it's kind of serving two purposes. It's at one point creating a record in the HABS or HALS collection, but it's also helping to preserve and rehabilitate this resource. Next slide, please. Another thing that you can use it for, unfortunately, is to reconstruct historic resources if they are lost due to earthquakes, fires, or other natural disasters. This is an example in Northern California of a 19th century Russian Orthodox chapel that was destroyed in 1970. Fortunately, the building had been documented by the HABS collection or HABS in the 1960s. So here's a photograph of the original building. Next slide, please. Here, well, here's a drawing of some of the details. And the next slide. Here is the reconstructed building. And obviously, this is especially relevant for Hawaii right now after the loss of so many historic resources in Lahaina. Fortunately, there is a large collection of drawings, or not large, but there is a collection of drawings of some of the historic resources in that historic district that, if depending on what happens there, they are available. So next slide. Another thing that you can use documentation for is while we still do hand drawing or hand measuring, a lot of modern technology relies on things like laser scanning and photogrammetry to accurately measure historic sites. What that does is create a plethora of digital material like 3D point clouds and models, pano photography that is used to create drawings and other traditional documentation. But then is kind of sitting out there. And what we've been seeing recently is working with people like NASA on the project here on the screen to come up with other types of digital interpretation that allow people to see things that they might not get to see otherwise. And if these slides get handed out, there's a link here so you can go and see where we've collected all of this digital three-dimensional documentation so that the public can go and look at these rocket test stands in California. Next slide. Oh, and that's it. All right, so I will hand it over to Jay.
All right. Thank you, Scott. Good morning, everybody. My name is Jay Sturdivant. I am the Integrated Resources Division Lead at Pearl Harbor National Memorial and Honolulu National Historic Site. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about some field documentation that we did for a project that we recently completed at Honolulu National Historic Site. which is the newest park here on Oahu. Next slide. Yeah. So Honouliuli National Historic Site was established as a national monument by President Barack Obama in 2015. And in 2019, the park was changed to a National Historic Site through congressional legislation, and is now an established unit of the National Park Service. The park is currently not open to the public, but if you would like to learn more about the park and learn more about the history there, you can visit the park on the park website at www.nps.gov/Hono. We have some good resources there for folks to learn about the history. Next slide. So I'll just talk quickly about the history of the site and then kind of moved into the project. So Honouliuli incarceration camp was established as part of Executive Order 9066, which was the executive order that created the Western Exclusion Zone and the Japanese American incarceration program. And so on this map here, you can see all of the various sites that were associated with that incarceration program, including several in Hawaii. And so the park, Honouliuli National Historic Site, is designated to preserve and protect the remains of the Honouliuli camp. But it also is to interpret the incarceration program across the state of Hawaii. So the park has sort of a broader mission beyond its boundary, which is to interpret the incarceration program across the state. There were about 128,000 Japanese Americans that were incarcerated during World War II as part of this program. Incarceration started in Hawaii the day of December 7th. And so by that evening, the FBI was arresting people that they had been monitoring on some pre-arranged FBI monitoring lists. And so initial incarceration and detention started at Sand Island in Honolulu. And then in 1943, it moved to Honouliuli Camp, which was established to hold about 400 Japanese American citizens and about 4,000 POWs. Next slide. So this just shows real quickly the location of, oh, actually that star's in the wrong place. The location of the park, which is actually a little southwest of where that star shows on this map. It should be a little west of Waipahu. But on the right, you can see the map there that kind of outlines the layout of the camp. You can see the various compounds. Japanese American incarcerees were held in Compound 5. And the rest of the compounds were contained POWs. And those POWs range from about 2,500 Koreans who were mostly conscripted labor for the Japanese Imperial Army. But there are also Filipinos, Okinawans, Italians, and Germans held at Honouliuli Camp. Next slide, please. And this just some historic photos of the camp. You can see it's a sort of mix of wood frame structures and tents. This gulch was known to the incarcerees as Jidoku Dani, or otherwise known as Hell Valley. You can see it's very sparse. There's not a lot of shade, and it gets really hot on this area of the island. Next slide, please. Just a couple more photographs. The photograph on the left is actually the U.S. Army Guard compound, and so that's where a lot of the soldiers and others. This is the area of the camp where the U.S. Army contingent was located. Next slide. So what I wanted to discuss today is a little bit about a stone and mortar wall preservation project. And so in this slide, you can see where this arrow is pointing to a retaining wall on the north side of the road across from these wood frame structures. And so this is a close-up, a little bit zoomed in of the wall, and you can see it's stone with mortar. It has multiple courses, and then on the far right-hand side, you can see that the wall does have a little curve in it. And so it's straight for most of its length, but then at the one end, it has a little bit of a curve in it. And that area is where we're going to focus mostly, is that sort of area with that curve, because that's where we were having the problems. And these are some photographs of the wall itself, and you can see some of the very large cracks and missing stone. In one case, a stone was missing. And this is right just adjacent to where that curve starts. And so about 60 feet of the wall was bulging significantly and was getting very close to a point of failure. And so the park had designed a preservation project. Next slide, please. In cooperation with Glen Mason Architects, who put together the design plans that you see on the right there. And so we developed this plan to essentially deconstruct the wall in this area and then rebuild it with a better drainage system and a better fill system behind it. And one of the things you can see on the photograph on the left is that the fill behind the wall was actually mostly just broken up pieces of concrete. There was not a lot of fill and other kinds of materials back there. So there was a lot of voids and a lot of very unstable material behind the wall. Next slide. Oh, actually, could you back up one slide, please? My apologies. So one of the things I'll note in the photograph on the left, you can see the mortar cap on the top of the wall. In that mortar cap, there were two inscriptions. And right where Andrea is highlighting there with her cursor, you can see part of one of those inscriptions. So those inscriptions were, at least one of them was probably a post-camp repair that was done to the wall. And the second inscription, we couldn't really determine a specific date for that inscription, but it did have the name of H. Matsumoto in it. That was in the second inscription. You'll see a couple images of those as we go forward. But part of the issue with these inscriptions was, in order to deconstruct the wall, those inscriptions were probably going to have to be removed. And in order to remove them, it was likely that they would have to be removed in pieces, because we could already see that they were cracked. And so in several places on the inscriptions, we could see that we just were not going to be able to get them off in one piece unless we took the first top course of the wall with it, which would mean that we would lose those stones in the wall and we would have to make new ones. And so it was decided that it was better to retain the historic stones and remove the inscriptions from the wall. And so this was not done as a mitigation. This was done in consultation with the Hawaii SHPD office, and the determination for this project was a no adverse effect determination. So this was really a documentation for benefit of the resources in the park, and for sort of long-term future documentation for these inscriptions, because we were pretty sure that we were going to retain these inscriptions in the collection. But we just couldn't put them back on the wall as they were, because we knew that they were going to come off in pieces. Next slide, please. So we determined a multi-step method of recording these inscriptions so that we could remove them. And as Elaine discussed in her presentation, it's really important to think about multiple levels of documentation with things like this. And this is something I learned in my past career as a previous job as an archaeologist, when we would do geophysical surveys on archaeological sites. we always would want to utilize multiple instruments for those surveys because each one of those instruments tells you something different about what is there. And they read different kinds of information. And so it was really important to get a better sense of these different data types. And so we would often want to collect multiple types of data, even if we knew that one instrument in particular is going to work well. And so in this case, it was sort of similar. We wanted to create multiple types of documentation so that there would be multiple levels of that kind of recording and in multiple ways so that people could access it for different needs and also to create some redundancy in our documentation. So I'm going to go through a bit of a step-by-step now on how we did this. So the first thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to identify what you want to record. And it's really important that you do this and you put some thought into, what is the thing that I'm trying to record here? And so you want to remove all the loose dirt and vegetation so make sure you can see the entirety of what you might want to record. And you want to inspect it closely. Sometimes inscriptions and impressions can be very subtle. And we saw that on this in this case in a couple places. There are letters in these inscriptions, but they're really subtle. And depending on the lighting conditions, sometimes you could see it and sometimes you couldn't. And so you need to inspect closely so that you know and that you can capture everything that you're trying to record. And then you want to clear an area, probably a little larger of what you want to record, just so that you ensure that you capture the margins of that thing. So the next step is cleaning. And so you want to use, what we used was sterile water, just basic filtered water. They put a lot of chlorine and other kinds of things in tap water. And so in general, when we're dealing with preservation of materials, I try to use things that are as neutral as possible just to reduce the likelihood that we might cause an unanticipated impact. Damp cloths also work really well, or maybe even some sticky cloths, but light tacky, like you might use for painting or something, but nothing too strong that you would pull off material from the face. Then again, you want to clean the faces and the surrounding area. You want to remove all the loose dirt and rocks that you can. We also found that cans of compressed air work well. Cans that you use to clean keyboards or monitors or other things really helped get the dirt out of some of the cracks. You want to try to get as deep as you can in those because the latex is going to pull some of that dirt out and it'll become sort of part of that thing when you create it. So next slide. And then digital photographs. We took a lot of digital photographs as part of this process, and digital photographs are a great, very inexpensive way to document things. And there's a lot of really great techniques that you can use in digital photography to try to bring things out of photographs that you maybe can't always see with the naked eye. And so it's really great it's a great way to create documentation. You still can create film photographs. Film is still, black and white film in particular, still considered the archival standard, but it is getting harder and harder and more expensive to develop film. And so I most of the time just use digital photography these days. But it's really important to create a backup and a long-term storage plan for those. Next slide. And then once we had done our cleaning and our digital photography, we moved into our digital scanning. And to do this, we utilized a tablet computer to do that. And I would also mention that this would be another place where you could potentially employ other kinds of documentation, which we were somewhat time limited, and I didn't do that on this project, but this would be a good place where you could do scale drawings or rubbings on tracing paper with charcoal or crayon. Those are all really good methods of creating a physical documentation record. But for the digital scanning, we decided that this was the preferred method for this project. And so we utilized a tablet computer and apps that can process LiDAR and photogrammetry in the tablet. And as an employee of the National Park Service, I can't give you specifically the models and the types and makes that we used, but I think if you do your homework, you can figure out pretty quickly what models and apps that work for that. And so the goal here was to create a 3D image of the inscription. And this captures the surface and produces a photorealistic image of the scan. And with current technologies, you can generate a render from those scans in literally a couple minutes while you're standing there in the field, and you can see what you've captured. Next slide. So this series of images here actually shows you the renders that we created in the field. And so you can even see still some of the watermark on the face from that image. And this was created with LiDAR and a series of photographs, and then the tablet processed that into a 3D model that you can utilize. It's at scale, and it's a really useful, very quick way of documenting something like this. Next slide, please. And then after we did our digital documentation, we moved into creating a latex cast of the inscriptions. And this is to create, the goal here was to create a physical mold of these, a physical cast of these inscriptions to create a record that we would introduce into the park catalog, and it would be an object that we would catalog as a long-term curation item. And so in addition to just having a record of this, these castings can also be used to create molds that could, in theory, recreate those inscriptions. And so using this method, we could potentially recreate those inscriptions in plaster, concrete, or mortar, and at some point maybe install them back in the wall as a demonstration and what those might have looked like. So next slide. So with the casting, you want to apply a liberal amount of the latex, of the liquid latex, and you want to apply multiple coats between those. And we actually left this for several days and then would come back to it and apply another coat. And it was left out in the weather. It didn't really bother it at all to get rained on occasionally and stuff. And so it worked fine to leave a couple days dry time and then come back and add another coat. Once we did that, we could remove them by peeling them off the concrete. One of the things that we found is that you want to make sure that it is thick enough so it doesn't look thin anywhere, so that you really don't want it to be able to see through it. So you want to make it thick enough so you can't see through it anymore. And then you also want to don't feather the margins. You want to create a nice lip at the margins, as that'll help you start to peel back that. And once you get started peeling it, then you can, we used just like a tube, a paper tube or like a map tube, and then just sort of roll that off and peeled it off the concrete, and it ultimately it'll just release, and then you have your latex cast. Next slide. And then for the removal of inscriptions, we tried to remove them as intact as possible. Knowing that they were already cracked, we had some places where we could really identify, okay, this is where it's going to break, and this is the piece that we're going to take off next. And then we wanted to make sure that we had additional support there for those inscriptions as we remove them. And then, we had a proper repository and a curation facility where those would be stored long-term. And then you'll want to consider any preservation treatments that those might mean. And so after we removed the inscriptions, then our Historic Preservation Training Center crew went to work. And this is a couple photos of them dismantling the wall. And on the next slide, you'll see how once they had all of the stones removed and they were all laid out on the ground exactly as they were laid out on the wall, you can sort of see what the face of that wall looked like behind it. And on the right, you can see what the completed restored wall looks like. And so we now have a wall at Honouliuli that has been repaired. that is not in jeopardy of falling down and should last a very long time. So that, I think, next slide, please. That essentially finishes my project and documentation. So thanks, and I will pass it on to Matt.
Aloha kako. My name is Matt McDermott. I'm with Cultural Surveys Hawaii. I'm excited about story maps, and I appreciate HHS providing this opportunity to talk about them. Story maps are a relatively new and versatile tool for historic preservation. They're widely used in multiple disciplines. This slide shows 3 examples chosen at random. You can see story maps here from science, urban planning, and conservation. I will briefly talk about story maps in general to introduce the concept to those unfamiliar, and then I will focus on the Hilo story map as an example of how story maps are useful in documentation and information dissemination. This discussion will dovetail with discussion and examples from Noho Papa's story maps that will be discussed later in this presentation. Next slide, please. Just a quick disclaimer, I'm a fan, I'm a user, but I'm not, you could say a convert, but I'm not a creator of story maps. So technical details are not really my purview. A sense of place, geographical grounding, and storytelling, it's so important at the core of historic preservation. Story maps are a powerful tool developed by Esri, the Geographic Information Systems company, approximately 12 to 15 years ago, that allows anyone to combine maps with narrative, images, and multimedia, both audio and video. Story maps are hosted on Esri's ArcGIS Story Map Cloud. Importantly, Esri does not own the story map or the data it contains. Story maps are created through a modular interactive builder. No specialized computer language or coding skills like JavaScript or CSS are needed. As Alan Carroll, the head of Esri's Story Map Division, says, if you can build a PowerPoint, you can build a story map. Importantly, while story maps are generally created on larger screens, laptops or desktops, they are specifically designed to be viewed and used with all screen sizes, smartphones, tablets, and laptops, with the same overall experience. Story map creation resources have become meta in a way, in that there are now story maps on how to create story maps. You just have to look up Esri's websites. Next slide. This graphic shows the explosive growth of Esri story map. From humble beginnings in 2012, there are over 2.2 million Esri hosted story maps today. Importantly, Esri allows users to sign up for free to create and access story maps. There are also open source versions of story maps that can be created outside of the Esri story map system, so you have other options. Esri story maps wants users and welcomes both paying and free users. Esri offers paid subscriptions through its creator and GIS professional accounts, but also offers free public accounts that can create and publish story maps. Importantly, an account is not required to view stories that have been created in ArcGIS story maps and shared with everyone. Next slide, please. As with all published material, there are some cautions that must be kept in mind. Story maps are no different in this regard. Think about your content. Is what you're saying controversial? And is there another side of the story that is not conveyed by your presentation? Publishing detailed information about specific cultural resources, particularly location information, can lead to greater appreciation and enjoyment of resources, but it can also have negative consequences like vandalism and looting. You want to treat images and text used in story maps just like you would written published work to avoid copyright infringement. Next slide. I'd like to now focus on the creation and use life of a specific story map. Ua hilo ia ike ahu ake aloha. On the upper left, you have 2 links that will take you to this specific story map. The bottom left has the story map's business card with access links and a QR code. The QR code is a great pathway to the story map. It can be placed on stickers or business cards like this and distributed or displayed within the physical boundaries of the story map to get users to use the resource in real time as they stroll through Hilo. Next slide, please. Historic Hawaii Foundation began their story map program in 2019 with funding from the Hawaii State Foundation on Culture and the Arts. HHF's partners with the Hilo story map included Cultural Surveys Hawaii, who provided the GIS specialization, the University of Hawaii Hilo history professor Carrie Inglis and her students, ASM affiliate senior archaeologist Lokilani Brandt, whose master's thesis focused on the Wahipana, or storied places, of her hometown Hilo. The Hilo story map benefited from the resources of Hilo's Lyman Museum and Mission House as well. Next slide. While all places are unique, some places are more fascinating than others. Hilo's landscape has its foundation in traditional Hawaiian land use. Yet over the past 200 years, this landscape has been melded and combined with historical, multicultural features and places. This led to a layered cultural landscape that is well suited for story map or interpretation and information dissemination. Hilo is on a natural protected bay with bountiful shoreline and offshore marine resources, abundant fresh water, fertile volcanic agricultural soils, and nearby forest resources for building and medicine. Hilo was a site of early permanent settlement. Resource abundance led to Hilo's growth as a traditional Hawaiian place of cultural, political, and economic significance. Oral traditions and legends abound from these hundreds of years of traditional Hawaiian land use. In pre-contact times, Hilo was the residence of ali'i, or royalty, and was fully developed with fish ponds for aquaculture, agricultural fields, residences, temples. Kamehameha the Great resided here in the late 18th century while preparing his fleet of 800 war canoes to prosecute his eventual unification of the archipelago under his rule. The 5,000-pound Naha stone, pictured here at the bottom left, is a Hilo landmark. The stone was moved by Kamehameha in fulfillment of a prophecy that the one to shift the Naha stone would become a great warrior. With the changes brought about through Western post-contact, Hilo continued to play a leading role. In the early 1800s, sandalwood trade, as a whaling port in the mid-1800s, and Hilo continued as a religious center with the arrival of the Christian missionaries in the early 1820s. The images in the center of this slide are the Lyman Museum and Mission House, where the Hilo history of the missionary movement is documented. In the 1800s and 1900s, Hilo developed as a plantation town. Sugar was king, with massive infrastructure development and the importation of a multicultural workforce that made Hilo a cosmopolitan blend of Hawaiian, Chinese, Japanese, Puerto Rican, Korean, Portuguese, and others. While many storied coastal settlements have been transformed over time, Hilo's waterfront was transformed tragically and quickly by first the 1946 and then the 1960 tsunami. As shown on the images on the right, Hilo's once thriving Japanese coastal business district of Shinmachi, or Newtown, did not survive the coastal devastation. After the 1960 tsunami, the Hilo community recognized the need for a buffer along the coast and created a series of parks and recreation areas. Next slide. Let's get into what a story map looked like and how a user interfaces with it. An important first decision for story map creation is the where. For the Hilo story map, the coastal Wailuku River in the west and the Wailoa River on the east were the boundaries that were selected. Carrie Inglis's UH Hilo history students were not told, go research these specific areas. These are the targets of the story map. Instead, it was a more bottom-up approach where the student researchers went to the historical record, the community, they asked their elders, and they went for walks through the area to develop a list of locations that would be the story map focus. Through this process, 45 locations were selected to be featured on the story map. The image at the bottom right is the express map that shows the 45 places that were discussed in the story map. The 4 banners along the top of this page can be clicked on to go to the 4 components of the story map. Let's take a brief look at each. Next slide, please. Wahipana o Hilo, the storied places of Hilo. These are the 45 locations with text and images to inform and interpret these resources of Hilo's past. These can easily be used as a self-guided tour of coastal Hilo. Shown here is Mokuola, or Coconut Island, the renowned place of healing with its freshwater spring. Next slide. Story maps allow for layers of information. This section, the second banner along the top of the page, Ka'ua Kanilehua o Hilo, is an essay on Hilo's traditional Hawaiian past written by one of Carrie Inglis's Hilo students. This provides a foundation for understanding Hilo's traditional Hawaiian significance, a more in-depth context for many of the locations described in the first section, and includes a list of references for further information. Next slide. The third section of the story map, E Ho'umalu I Ke Kupa'a o Ka'aina, is another historical essay. It provides a context for Hilo's 19th century history and the storied places associated with this period. Next slide. The fourth section of the story map, Hilo ai Luau, is a number of historic photographs. These images help the story map user get a feel for the Hilo cultural landscape. Importantly, the I for information button in these images can be clicked for the image citation. Next slide, please. Andrea, if you could click the play button, that would help here. These next few slides are videos showing how the user interfaces with the story map. In this video, we are back at the healing island of Mokuola in Hilo Bay. You can see how the user can navigate to the different locations on the express map in the upper left corner and scroll through the descriptive text and images that go with this location. Once review of Mokuola is complete, the user can move on to the second location. Next slide, please. This video shows the story map swipe feature. It lets the user compare different images, in this case, historic on the left and modern on the right, photographs of Hilo One, or the sandy Hilo shorefront. This swipe feature is an important informational and interpretive tool. Next slide, please. And if you could hit play on that slide as well. This example is not from the Hilo story map, but from HHF's Honoka'a story map. This video shows how images, text, and audio can be combined. The user can get to know the informant and hear the story in their own words. For the Honoka'a story map, several informants contributed their stories. Next slide, please. This is one of my favorite features of story maps, the ability to put the user's location directly on maps within the story map while being used. Here we have a modern aerial photograph of Hilo in color, overlain on black and white 1891 Baldwin map of Hilo. If the user were using the story map with a location-enabled device through GPS or cell towers, for example, a tablet or a phone, while they were physically in this area shown on the map, then clicking on the location button at the bottom right would allow the user's location to be shown on the figure in real time. This allows users to interact and explore the historic maps, comparing older and newer land use. Next slide, please. Further information about the Hilo story map development and impact is available through the YouTube link above. This is the presentation and panel discussion that accompanied the publishing of the Hilo story map in December of 2021. The elegant testimonials and experiences of the students that made up part of the panel discussion I found particularly informative. There were Malahini students, newcomers to Hilo, as well as born and raised Kama'aina. All these students learned and grew from their experience of putting the story map together. With over 7,500 views of the Hilo story map since it was published in 2021, it has led to community development and interaction with local residents as well as visitors using the story map. Next slide, please. To wrap up, I just wanted to touch on a few more points. It's clear Esri's ArcGIS story map platform is expanding with new users every day. As a cultural resource management archaeologist, I'm concerned about the volume of so-called gray literature, studies, reports, and plans that our industry produces. Historically, these studies have very limited audiences, and they are relegated to agency libraries. Story maps are a great way to get this literature out into a wider audience. Story maps easily incorporate information from various sources: academic, CRM, historic preservation, and community stakeholder. Story maps offer a low-cost means to widely disseminate information. No specialized computer or coding knowledge is needed. And this discussion will dovetail well with Noho Papa's upcoming presentation with more experience with story maps. That's it for me. I want to thank you, and I'll turn it over to Lilia now.
Aloha mai kako. My name is Lilia Marin. I am the Cultural Research Specialist and Tech Specialist for Noho Papa, Hawaii. I'm also going to be sharing about some story maps with you, but first I just wanted to share a little bit about our organization, our methods that go into building these story maps. So Noho Papa Hawaii provides a wide range of Hawaiian cultural resource management services to assist agencies, organizations, private landowners, communities in protecting and restoring important wahikupuna or ancestral places in order to reestablish cultural traditions. So Noho Papa is a little bit different. We're not compliance-based, and really our organization's mission is to strengthen generational ties and time-honored commitments between communities and their lands. And one of the ways in which we do that is through the research studies that we do, studies that deepen cultural connections, support our communities, protect places, enable our partners to engage in responsible and informed management and decision-making, and research that's not only innovative and original, but driven by primary resources. We really strive to accurately convey cultural and ethnohistorical context and importance. And the way in which we do that is through a few methods. The first is through ethnohistorical research. So using archival records, which include, but not limited to, historical maps, documents, journals, newspaper articles, pictures, mohele documents. We really try to understand place names, the winds, the rains, the mo'olelo, the natural resources, the change in landscape over time. And we take that information and we try to interpret and understand these places. Another way that we collect ike kupuna, or ancestral knowledge, to understand our aina is through ethnographic research. So doing community interviews or learning from previous interviews from individuals, ohana, organizations that have relationships to these places, and learning from their knowledge of their traditional practices, their experiences, their beliefs to associated to place. And I just wanted to quickly note that interviewing and working alongside our community for them to open up and share with us has really been an honor for Noho Papa. We really value the ike that we learn from them as kupa aina, because they're so intimately connected to aina and wahikupuna. And we just want to say mahalo to all of you that we've worked with. We're so grateful. And last but not least, we also do archaeological research. So full disclosure, that's not my expertise. I mainly focus on ethnohistorical and ethnographic research. But as Matt has just previously shared, mahalo Matt, we also use story maps as a really cool tool to disseminate our research and ike kupuna found within these studies, so that these reports don't just end up on shelves, but kind of become more tangible tools for and accessible tools for our community to use. So I'm really excited to geek out and show you two examples for our research that have been integrated into story maps. I'm going to go one by one. The first example is our Oahu Aina Inventory Study Series, which was a partnership with Kamehameha Schools. And the second example is our Wahiho'ola study series with Papa'ololokahi. And I'm gonna pop it up here on the screen very shortly. And what was cool about these studies is, although they're from two different organizations, they kind of piggybacked on one another. And what we learned from one study helped inform and contribute the other. So let's start with the Oahu Aina Inventory Study. Again, a project in partnership with Kamehameha Schools. So this was comprised of 5 studies, one for each moku, except for Ko'olauloa and Ko'olaupoko. That was, they were done together. Our very first study that we did was Eva, and then we moved to Kona, then to Wai'anae, then the Ko'olaus, and then we just wrapped up our Waialua study. And we worked on these studies over the course of the last 5 years. Within each of these studies, each chapter is about an ahupua'a that we look at. And we do a synthesis of historical research, ethnographic information, wahipana data, and the current stewardship and restoration efforts taking place within the ahupua'a in order to create a richer understanding of the historical and contemporary cultural landscape. So for these studies, we were able to reach out to over 149 organizations and individuals across Oahu to participate in this project. So for this project, there were several key research activities or components, which included ethnohistorical research, community engagement, GIS mapping, and a cultural landscape inventory. So to test drive this, you have your navigation bar at the top, a little bit of information about the project itself. This is like a table of contents, so you're able to jump around. And then you have the overview of the report itself. You can click on the link here to get the full report. What's really cool, and I think what the meat of the story map is this interactive map on the side. So these interactive maps allow you to kind of explore. You can jump from ahupua'a to ahupua'a, and on the left-hand side, a panel pops up with our chapter, or a shortened version of our chapter, which gives you an overview. If you want to read the chapter, you click on the button. It'll take you over to our Noho Papa website. And from there, you should be able to download the report itself and learn about all the different mo'olelo, mele, place names, historical overview, community groups, etc. What I love about it is you can also click on the map. We have different maps that are included on here. This is our Wahi Ho'ola map or Wahi Kupuna map. You can also save these as well. And then what else do I want to show you? If you scroll up to the top, you can also click to get the moku maps, our kula or school maps, and also the community maps. And we've also dated them so you can see the latest version or the most recent version of the map. What I really like too is that about story maps is that, you know, if you want to share this with your ohana about an area, you can click the hyperlink and send this anchor over to somebody, and it'll take you directly to the resource that you want. At the bottom, we also included some really cool resources. So some of these resources we included in throughout our project, but oops. Let's get back down there. Yeah, so just some resources, some additional resources if you want to learn more about the moku. And yeah, so the purpose, and then we also have our methods down at the bottom. So you can see how we, it's a short overview of our methods. But I think what's important is the purpose of these Aina inventory studies, which is to educate and to support the development of curriculum to create a process to build shared community sense of place. And so this is the Aina inventory study. I am going to move on to my next example, which is the Wahiho'ola study series. I'm going to click on over here. And because we already had an inventory and an understanding of the landscape, and we had spent some time learning from the community, we were able to conduct the Wahiho'ola inventory series. The overall goal for this project was to develop an inventory of wahiho'ola, or healing spaces, for each moku on Oahu. So we started with Kona, and then we moved to Ewa and Waianae. We just wrapped up the Waialua, and we're really excited to be working on the Ko'olau'aina inventory study right now. So stay tuned. But the initial research was to really help lay the kahua, or the foundation, for future work, because there's really no way you can possibly learn everything about an aina in 6 months to a year. And in addition to this inventory, we went ahead and looked at specific focus sites within each moku, which I'll dive into in just a second. So for this project, there were also several key components of research activities, which included ethnohistorical research, community engagement, GIS mapping, building a lexicon or a vocabulary around healing to understand what is healing, and also a wahiho'ola inventory. So we'll start with our very first one that we did, the Kona Wahiho'ola inventory study. At the top is a little bit about the project. Again, you can click on the link, which will take you to the full report. The map is really cool, interactive. So the blue dots show you the Wahiho'ola inventory itself. And you're able to learn just a little bit more when you click on the interactive map. We have a brief discussion about what Wahiho'ola is, but in all honesty, every time we do this project, we learn a little bit more we add to this growing vocabulary each time we talk to community and learn about place. This is really cool. This is a Wahikupuna. So the stars are the Wahiho'ola, and around it, you can see the different resources that surround these Wahiho'ola. So the pu'u, the maps, the Wahikupuna, water resources. We like to orient our user to place. So a little bit about the area and the moku itself. And then we dive into what are called focus sites. So we have this big inventory, and we choose maybe about 4 to 6 Wahiho'ola sites. And it's really hard to choose. Like, how do you choose all of these amazing places? Like, how do you choose to just look at 4 to 6? So we had to kind of create some criteria, which is, is the site still in existence? Is it still being stewarded by an ohana individual or community group? Are there mo'olelo or additional resources available for the site? So I'm gonna just kind of scroll through this, I think. So for this Kona Wahiho'ola inventory studies, we looked at Ka'i'i'eheo in Kalihi. We also looked at Ke'ehi and Mokowea. I'm not going to go into all of them, but I can just kind of show you some of the things that we have on here. So we have Ke'ehi and Mokowea as another site that we dove into. Kunawai Spring, this was really interesting. I thought Kunawai was just one location, but it turned out to be comprised of 6 different bodies of water. And a lot of these areas today, and they all had their own purpose, function, and meaning, but a lot of them today are now covered by a basketball court or filled in. But we go through kind of the history and change of landscape over time, showing maps and historical photos. Kumulai Spring was another one that we looked at. This one is where the Old Willows restaurant used to be. Maoki Heo. This was surprising. It's the off-ramp near the H1 off-ramp near University. And then some familiar ones, right, down in Waikiki, such as the Paiki'i Mahu, or the healing stones that most of us pass by. And so the purpose of these Wahiho'ola studies was not just to collect all of this documentation, but to really relearn about these spaces and these places, to connect people back to these places and reestablish these connections. And every time we do these studies, we learn something new. So a new nuance about the landscape, these themes that pop out at us, and sometimes themes happen during certain periods of time. And for Noho Papa, we really want to be able to continue to assist and support our communities by providing this type of level of research and these tools and our expertise to support their kuleana to malama these places. If you have any questions or would like to know more about these projects or any other projects that we've worked on, please feel free to reach out to me at lilia@nohopapa.com, which I will drop in the chat in just a second. Or you can visit our website as well, www.nohopapa.com/projects. And with that, I just wanted to close by saying mahalo nui loa to Andrea and Kristen, Hawaii Historic Foundation, National Park Service for having Noho Papa here today and for providing us, all of us, this space to share about preservation, interpretation, access, storytelling, ike kupuna, and for us, you know, how technology is evolving and changing these opportunities. So, oia wale no mahalo.
Thank you to all of our presenters. I'm going to invite you all to come back, and we have about 10 minutes or so for some Q&A. But I'm just really impressed with the depth and the breadth of the work that's being done and all these different examples. And it's really exciting to be able to share, you know, just a little piece of all the great work that's being that's going on, you know, across so many different institutions and partnerships, and just really want to thank you all for the work you've been doing. So we've had a few questions, but I'm going to start with one that I think, well, actually, let me just tell everybody we are recording this, and we will post both the recording and the slide materials to historichawaii.org, so that will be made available. And if we run out of time, we can also share questions with our presenters and kind of follow up with some answers later on as well. But I think a lot of people have been sharing their contact information. You can reach out to them directly. So one question I want to get started with, and this is to everybody. All of the examples that we've highlighted today are in the public realm. You know, Scott really emphasized that HABS HALS is copyright free. It's available to the public. Different examples have been of archives or digital resources. And we all know that once something is out there, you have no control over how it's used. So I'm wondering, are there any ethical guidelines, any best practices, any kind of standard operating procedures that help you decide what you keep confidential and private versus what you put out in the public? And how do you kind of manage that balance?
I can take a first stab at it from the HABS HALS side. We do take confidentiality seriously for certain things that you would take confidentiality into account in other preservation things. So if there's archaeological site information, other information that you do not want the location identified, we'll either not include it in the survey information or put a general location that doesn't allow it to be identifiable. So at the city level or the county level. So that's as far as kind of sensitive information for cultural resources. That's one thing that we do. Our other thing, which is on a completely different thing, is just copyright, which is a much more prosaic thing. But you obviously have to make sure whenever you're putting anything into the public realm that the things that you are offering to the public realm, you have the right to offer. So we require anything that is not created by a federal government agency to be signed off on and say, yes, we are releasing copyright for this information, or the repository that I got this information from is okay with us releasing copyright for this purpose.
Thank you, Scott.
I guess I could chime in a little bit, you know, kind of following from what Scott said. You know, some of what we've been talking about do qualify as archaeological resources under the Archaeological Resources Protection Act. And under that act and under the NHPA, there are provisions to restrict information as confidential and restrict it from even the FOIA process potentially. And so the threshold there was really if that public information would put the site at risk. And, you know, as you know, somebody that moved here to Hawaii about 3 years ago, I've been really interested to see that there's a lot more information out there in Hawaii than some other states, and I've been a little surprised to see that, honestly. And in other contexts, I would like that'd probably be not something that we would share like that, but anyway, there seems to be a little bit more openness here in Hawaii to some of that. But
in terms of, Hawaii State Historic Preservation rules and regulations, the administrative rules do talk about keeping sensitive information out of our reports and whatnot, certainly for burial sites and that sort of thing. So, without going into too much depth, it's basically we want to, if you're in the business of producing these types of things, you want to be familiar with those administrative rules and see what types of information should be kept back.
I'm going to tap into this too. From a tech perspective, we just try to be really careful about what we're putting online. We have really deep and thoughtful conversations within our hui, and sometimes we also, reach out to community as well, but just trying to be really thoughtful about what we're putting online, and how we're sharing it. So trying not to put every single location on the map, but just trying to have really deep and thoughtful conversations about what we do before we do.
And I'll just add, I think most of what folks have talked about is kind of, locations. And I think that there's information that people get from whether it's oral history interviews or whatever the case may be. And we have to respect the purpose why how we've received that information and what the purpose was, and to ensure that we have permission to share that information. We have professional standards for oral history, but for professionals, but even if you're not a professional, you would want to do best practice and make sure that you have permission to share the information and for what purposes you are permitted to share it.
Thank you all. Another question we're getting has to do with the longevity and sustainability of digital resources. And we know how quickly technology changes. We know that things that were digitized, in the 1970s on microfiche or microfilm are unreadable now. DVDs are obsolete. Thumb drives seem to be going away. How do you put all these resources into developing these digital resources, but how long are they really going to be around? And do you have any best practices or ideas around how to make sure they don't just become obsolete, as soon as they're done?
Maybe I'll try to take a crack at this one. So, for us, yes, technology is constantly moving forward. And I think when we do really good work, we want to be able to share that technology has been wonderful because it has allowed an avenue for us to be able to share ike with community at wider, spread our upena a little bit wider, which has been wonderful. For the story map aspect of it, we really put a lot of thought into how we built the story map and trying to make it sustainable. So we manage our website, our Noho Papa website, and everything is a lot of the links on our story map are linked directly to our Noho Papa website. So we manage that information, and we're going to continue to manage those resources and that information. And then another thing with the story maps too, which I don't know if I was able to share, what's really cool about them is that you can embed them to other websites. So, you can take the link and embed them directly to another place. So you can share it better, a little bit further.
I'll just add that if you think about in particular the story maps, a lot of that information, it was a mode or a tool for sharing, but a lot of the information was gathered and recorded analog. Obviously, there are the digitization or more high tech point clouds and things like that. That's not my area of expertise. I don't know what the tools are for making sure that information is sustained, but I do think a lot of what was presented was based on analog recorded information.
for the digital realm, one of the things I like to advocate for is redundancy and backup. So you want to make sure that you have redundant backups to in case you lose one of your copies, you'll have backup copies. A migration plan is not a bad idea, to look at, at what points do you migrate your data to other media, or how do you sort of keep that long-term sort of accessibility with that data. And then with things like point clouds and stuff, always trying to get sort of the basic data sets out of that. And so, point cloud is essentially just XYZ data. And there should be, with all point cloud data, just a basic file with like a number and then the XYZ sort of coordinates attached to it. And so just keeping that basics that you can reprocess as software evolves and things is really important. And I've seen that done with geophysical data that is from like 1978 that was stored on floppy drives that, could be because they had stored it on just a basic spreadsheet, we were able to resurrect that data and reprocess it. So it can be done. You just have to put a little bit of structure around it.
Thank
And
you.
I'll just add really quickly, that's something that we talk a lot with the National Archives and the Library of Congress about, is trying to figure out what formats are archivally stable. They do have, if you go on the National Archives website, there are recommended digital file formats. So even for things like PDFs or TIFFs and things like that, of how they think will be the most stable way to store those. We're currently, as Jay was saying, like we have a requirement internally to actually archive our point clouds that we generate inside of our office with the National Archives. And so we've been discussing how to develop an archivally stable format. They recently agreed to E57s, which are a format of point cloud storage. However, now we're finding out that the way each proprietary program reads and generates E57s is different. So theoretically, it should be non-proprietary, but each program is creating it in a proprietary manner. So we're starting to think, should we just be listing these things as coordinates, as like ASCII files, basically? So yeah, it's something that there are lots of librarians and archivists throughout the country that are thinking about, but it's definitely something people should consider when they're creating this stuff.
Thank you all. We're running short on, oh, sorry, Jay.
I was just going to say, can I address Bill Chapman's question real quick? Yes.
Sure.
Yes, please.
Bill Chapman's question is, you want to repeat it?
Any reason to still measure in a traditional way? Yes, and also making hand-drawn scale maps is still great, and there's a lot of reasons why you're going to continue to do that. There are parts of, I'll tell you, parts of northern Minnesota where you can't use some of these digital technologies. All you have is a pencil and a graph paper.
I'll jump onto that too. There are still things when we document things, we have all kinds of crazy laser scanners. A laser scanner can't get like a molding profile correct. It shoots too much at it. You'll be much better at taking a molding comb and just tracing it onto a piece of graph paper. So yes, I think at present there are certain things which no matter what, hand measuring is better. And in a lot of cases, you don't have to, take more technology than you need. You can always go out with a tape measure or a string and still measure things. So yeah, we still do it even though we have laser scanners. So yeah.
We do need to wrap up for this, but I'll mention again that at historichawaii.org, we will post the recording, the presentation, but also some links to other resources. So a lot of the story maps that were discussed, a lot of the technical guidance that was discussed, a lot of the background information, we will post that to our website as well. And Andrea will send out a link to all of that. And as we close out the webinar, you will see a pop-up course evaluation. So we would really ask everyone to complete that for us. It's really helpful for us to both know what resonates with people, what upcoming topics might be useful. For those architects who have attended, be sure to put in your name and your AIA number if you'd like to get your continuing education credits. And with that, I just really want to mahalo all of you. I found this really fascinating and learned a lot myself, and I really hope that all of you enjoyed being here with us. So thank you so much. Mahalo.